Someone like her doesn't belong in a place like this. The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. They moved across the restaurant like a quiet stain, subtle, spreading, impossible to ignore once noticed. Under warm golden lights in a high-end Chicago restaurant, where crystal glasses caught reflections and soft jazz drifted through the air, Ethan Cole stood still for just a second longer than usual, a tray balanced carefully in his hands, his expression unchanged, but his attention shifting. Across the room, near a corner table that no one wanted to look at for too long, sat a young girl in a pale blue dress, her legs supported by metal braces that caught the light every time she moved slightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she had learned to take up as little space as possible, as if she had learned that being unseen was safer than being noticed, and beside her, a plate of untouched food cooled slowly, steam fading into nothing. A second voice followed, softer, amused. Why would they even bring her here? A few quiet laughs. Not cruel enough to be called out. Not kind enough to be ignored. Ethan moved then. Not fast. Not hesitant. Just deliberate. 3 steps forward. Then another. The low hum of music filled the space between breaths, the scent of butter and seared steak lingering in the air, and somewhere behind him, his manager's voice cut through, sharp, controlled. Ethan, table 12. A reminder, a redirection, a boundary. Ethan nodded once, not turning, placing the tray down with quiet precision as his gaze settled fully on the girl, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the room itself was waiting to see what someone like him would do. A waiter with worn sleeves and steady hands. A single father who had learned long ago that dignity was not something given. It was something chosen. And as he approached her, he did not look at the braces first. He did not look at what made her different. He looked at her face, at the way her eyes avoided the room, at the quiet effort it took for her to simply exist in that space. And he lowered himself just enough to meet her at eye level, his voice calm, warm, grounded in something real. "Hey there," he said gently, and she blinked, surprised, like no one had spoken to her without hesitation all evening. The room still buzzing behind them. Conversations continuing, forks clinking, people pretending not to watch. But they were watching. They always were. Waiting for something awkward, something uncomfortable, something they could turn into a story later, and Ethan paused, just long enough to make a choice. Not reaction, not impulse, but intention, and then, with a small, respectful smile, he extended his hand. Not rushed, not performative, just honest, just simple. "Would you like to dance?" The question landed softly, almost too softly to be real, and somewhere in the room, a quiet laugh started to rise again, ready to turn this into another joke, another moment to dismiss. But it faltered, because something about the way he asked it did not allow it to grow, and the girl looked at his hand as if it might disappear if she reached too quickly, her fingers twitching slightly against the fabric of her dress. Uncertainty written into every small movement, and Ethan did not move, did not repeat himself, did not rush her. He simply waited, patient, steady, like a man who understood that some moments could not be forced, only offered. And then, slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his, light, hesitant, but real, and that small contact shifted something deeper than the room, something invisible but undeniable, and Ethan rose just enough to guide her, not pulling, not leading too fast, matching her pace step by step as the music wrapped quietly around them, her braces, catching the light again, but now, not as something to hide, but as part of a movement, part of a moment, and for a second, the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed, glasses clinking, voices murmuring, but one by one, those sounds began to fade, not because they were told to stop, but because something quieter had taken their place, something that asked for attention without demanding it. And near the back of the room, partially hidden in shadow, a woman who had not touched her drink since it arrived, watched without blinking, her posture composed, her expression unreadable at first, but her eyes fixed, following every step, every movement, every choice, and she did not smile. Not yet. She did not speak. She simply observed, as if measuring something far more valuable than service or presentation. And as Ethan guided the girl through a slow turn, his voice low and steady, "You are doing great." Something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because what began as a moment of quiet kindness was becoming something else entirely, something that no one in that room could interrupt, and somewhere between one step and the next, without announcement, without recognition, everything had already begun to change. For a moment after her hand met his, the room did not know what to do with itself, the soft rhythm of jazz continuing as if nothing had changed, yet everything felt different, like a quiet thread had been pulled loose and no one could quite find where it began, and Ethan did not rush. He did not lead her into anything she was not ready for. He simply matched her, step for step, movement for movement, his hand steady, his presence grounded, and the girl followed, uncertain at first, her steps uneven, careful, her braces catching the light with each shift, but there was something else now, something new, something that had not been there when she first sat down, and it was not confidence yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of it, the possibility of it, and that alone was enough to quiet the room, and behind them, a chair scraped lightly as someone adjusted for a better view, another whisper rising. "Is he serious?" But this time it did not grow into laughter, it faded, because something about the moment refused to be reduced, refused to be dismissed, and Ethan's voice remained low, calm, consistent, just like that. He murmured, "You are doing perfect," and the girl let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, the kind that had been waiting for permission to exist, and across the room, the manager's expression tightened, his posture shifting from irritation to concern, because this was not part of the service, this was not efficient, this was not controlled, and he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the quiet, sharper now. "Ethan," he said, not loud, but firm, "that is enough." And for a second, the moment trembled, not broken, but tested, because that was the line, the point where most people would stop, would step back, would return to what was expected, and Ethan heard him. Of course he did. He always heard everything, years of service had taught him that, but he did not stop, not immediately, because the girl's hand in his had just tightened slightly, her steps beginning to find a rhythm, fragile but real, and breaking that now would mean more than disobedience. It would mean taking something away that had only just begun to form. And so he made a quiet decision, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that costs something later. And he finished the step they were in, just one more turn, just one more breath. And the room leaned in without moving, forks paused midair, glasses left untouched, conversations dissolving into silence. And even those who had laughed before now found themselves unsure of where that laughter had come from, unsure of what had seemed so easy to dismiss only moments earlier. And the girl lifted her chin slightly, her eyes no longer fixed on the floor but on Ethan, following him, trusting him. And for the first time that night, she was not trying to disappear, she was simply there, and near the back of the room. The woman who had been watching remained still, her gaze unwavering, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of her glass, her attention absolute. And if anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the smallest shift in her expression, something guarded loosening, something measured becoming personal, and the manager stepped closer now, his tone tighter, controlled but edged with warning. "Ethan, we are not running a show here." And the words landed this time, but not in the way he intended. They did not break the moment. They revealed it. They made it clearer, what this was and what it was not. And Ethan turned his head just slightly, enough to acknowledge the voice without breaking the connection in front of him. And in that brief glance, there was no defiance, no challenge, just calm. Just a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him and exactly what he was choosing instead. And then he looked back at the girl, his attention returning fully, completely, and they took one final step together, slow, deliberate, the kind that closes a moment with intention rather than interruption. And when the music softened into a quieter note, Ethan gently released her hand, not abruptly, not carelessly, but with the same respect he had offered from the beginning. And for a second, nothing happened, no applause, no reaction, just stillness, the kind that fills a space when something meaningful has just occurred but has not yet been understood. And then the girl smiled, small at first, but real, and somewhere behind them, a chair moved, slow, deliberate, drawing attention without asking for it. And from the back of the room, The woman who had been watching finally stood. The sound of her heels did not need to be loud to be heard. Each step measured, controlled, the kind of presence that shifted a room without asking permission, and one by one, heads turned, not because they were told to, but because something about her movement carried weight, the kind people recognize before they understand it, and the manager saw her first, his posture changing instantly, irritation replaced with something tighter, more careful, recognition settling into his expression before. He could hide it. And yet Ethan had not turned. Not yet. His attention still on the girl, on the way her shoulders had relaxed, on the way her smile had begun to hold, and he gave her a small nod, grounding the moment. "You did amazing," he said softly, and she looked up at him like she was trying to remember how to accept that, how to believe it. And for a second longer, the world outside that small space did not exist. And then he felt it, not a touch, not a sound, but a shift in the air. Behind him, and he turned, slowly, not rushed, not startled, just aware, and his eyes met hers. The woman from the back of the room now standing only a few feet away, her expression composed, her gaze direct, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but full of observation, of something forming without words, and the manager stepped forward quickly, his voice already adjusting, respectful now, controlled. "Ms. Harper, I apologize, this was not." But she lifted her hand slightly, not sharply, just enough, and he stopped, immediately, the rest of his sentence dissolving into nothing, and she did not look at him again, her attention returning fully to Ethan, as if he were the only person in the room that mattered in that moment. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying without force. "What is your name?" And Ethan answered without hesitation, not overly formal, not casual, just honest. "Ethan Cole." And she nodded once, as if placing the name somewhere important, and then her eyes moved briefly to the girl, softening in a way that could not be mistaken, before returning to him. And there was a pause, a quiet breath where the entire room seemed to lean in again, waiting, not for drama, but for meaning, and behind them, a glass was set down gently, the faintest sound marking the stillness, and the manager shifted his weight, uncertain now, no longer in control of the moment he had tried to correct, and then she spoke again, her words simple, unadorned, but carrying more weight than anything else said that night. "Do you always do that?" And Ethan did not rush his answer. He did not try to impress. He did not search for the right words. He simply told the truth the way he always had, steady and unembellished. "I try to treat people the way they deserve, even when no one is watching." And something changed then, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because for the first time since she stood, the woman's expression shifted in a way that could not be hidden, a subtle release, a quiet recognition, as if she had been waiting to hear exactly that. And the girl looked between them, her small smile still present, unaware of the full weight of the moment, but feeling its warmth, and the room, still silent, held that exchange like something fragile, something that should not be interrupted. And then she spoke again, her voice softer now, more personal. She stopped dancing a long time ago, and the words settled into the space between them, not as information, but as truth. And Ethan listened, really listened, the way he had learned to do as both a father and a man who understood that some things are not said lightly. And he nodded once, not claiming credit, not offering explanation, just acknowledging what had been given. And for a moment longer, they stood there, the weight of what had just happened settling into the room, not as noise, not as spectacle, but as something quieter, something that could not be undone. And in that stillness, every person watching understood something they had not expected to feel, that dignity did not need permission, that kindness did not ask for approval, and that sometimes the most powerful person in a room is the one who chooses to see someone else when no one else will. The silence did not break all at once, it loosened slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding something too fragile to interrupt. And Victoria Harper remained where she stood, her gaze steady, no longer observing from a distance, but fully present now, fully engaged. And Lily looked up at her, her small hands resting lightly against the table, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying something bright, something new. "Mom." I danced. and the words seemed to move through the room with a weight far greater than their sound. And for the first time, Victoria's expression softened completely, the controlled composure giving way to something unmistakably human, something that had nothing to do with power or reputation. And she stepped closer, lowering herself slightly, not concerned with polished image, not concerned with who might be watching, only with her daughter. "I saw," she said gently, her voice warm in a way no one in that room had expected, and Lily smiled, not cautiously now, but openly, as if the moment had given her permission to exist without apology. And behind them, a quiet murmur began to form, not mocking, not dismissive, but uncertain, people trying to process what they had just witnessed, because it did not fit the patterns they were used to. And the manager, still standing just behind Victoria, shifted again, his confidence replaced with careful calculation, his tone adjusting quickly. "Miss Harper, we can arrange something more comfortable, a private space." But she did not respond immediately, her attention still on Lily, her hand resting lightly on her shoulder, grounding, reassuring. And then she rose slowly, turning back to Ethan with a look that was no longer distant, no longer analytical, but deliberate. And she took a breath, just one, as if choosing her words with care, not because she lacked them, but because she understood their weight. "Do you know what you just did?" she asked, her voice calm but deeper now, carrying something beneath the surface. And Ethan did not rush to answer. He did not assume. He simply met her gaze and said quietly, "I asked her to dance." And a few people in the room exhaled softly, almost involuntarily, because the simplicity of that answer stood in contrast to everything they were beginning to feel. And Victoria held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "No," she said gently, not correcting harshly, but reframing. "You gave her something she stopped believing she deserved." And the words settled into the room like a truth no one could argue with. And Lily looked between them again, her smile still present, unaware of the full depth of what had just been said, but feeling its importance in the way the adults around her had gone quiet. And Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, not out of discomfort, but out of humility, because he had not acted for recognition. He had not acted for reward. He had acted because it was the right thing to do in a moment where most people chose not to act at all. And the music in the background shifted again, softer now, almost like an echo of what had just taken place. And a man at a nearby table slowly set down his glass, his expression thoughtful, no longer amused, no longer detached. And the manager, sensing the shift slipping further from his control, attempted once more, his voice measured, careful. "Mr. Cole, perhaps you should return to your duties." But before Ethan could respond, Victoria spoke, her tone still calm, still even, but carrying a quiet finality that needed no repetition. "He is exactly where he needs to be." And that was it. No raised voice, no dramatic declaration. Just a simple statement that closed the space for argument entirely. And the manager nodded quickly, stepping back without another word, his authority dissolving not through confrontation but through clarity. And Ethan remained there, not elevated, not changed in position, but seen in a way he had not been before. And for the first time that night, the room did not look at him as a waiter, they looked at him as a man. And in that subtle shift, something larger than the moment itself began to take shape, something that would not end when the music faded, something that would follow long after the last plate was cleared, because quiet dignity, once witnessed, does not disappear, it stays, it lingers, and it changes the way people see what truly matters. For a moment after her words settled, no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because something about the moment had already decided itself. And Ethan stood where he was, not elevated, not transformed into anything he was not, just present, just steady, the same man who had walked across the room without asking permission. And Victoria watched him with a kind of focus that was no longer distant, no longer observational, but intentional, as if she were no longer studying a moment, but a person. And Lily remained close, her small hand still resting lightly against her mother's arm, her expression calm, her smile lingering like something she did not want to lose. And the restaurant, once filled with quiet judgment and careless whispers, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by discomfort, but by awareness. the kind that settles when people realize they have witnessed something they cannot easily explain, and Victoria took a small step forward, not imposing, not commanding, but closing the distance enough to make what came next real. "Ethan," she said, his name now carrying weight because it had been chosen, remembered. "How long have you worked here?" And Ethan answered simply, without embellishment, without hesitation, 3 years. And the number did not sound impressive, did not sound significant, but in the way he said it, it held something else: consistency, effort, a quiet kind of endurance that rarely receives attention. And Victoria nodded once, absorbing that, not as data, but as context, and her eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the space, the people, the subtle shifts that had already begun, before returning to him. "And you have a daughter," she added, her tone gentle, not probing, but understanding, and Ethan glanced toward Lily for just a second, a reflex more than a decision, then back to Victoria. "Yes," he said, and that was enough. No elaboration needed, because some truths do not need to be explained to be understood, and Victoria's expression softened again, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to notice, enough to reveal that something personal had already connected between them, something that had nothing to do with status or circumstance. And she took another breath, measured, deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not authority, not control, but intention. "I do not usually approach people like this," she said. And a faint murmur moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, just enough to mark the shift. "But what you did tonight," she paused, not searching for words, but choosing the right ones, "was not small." And the statement landed in a way that made people straighten slightly, as if they had just realized they were part of something that extended beyond the walls of the restaurant. And Ethan listened, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, not absorbing praise, not deflecting it, simply letting it exist, without altering who he was. And Victoria continued, her gaze unwavering now. "You saw her," she said quietly, and the simplicity of that phrase carried more meaning than anything else she could have said, because seeing someone, truly seeing them, is not something that happens often, not in rooms like this, not in lives built on movement and noise and expectation. And Lily looked up again, her smile softening into something more thoughtful, as if she understood, even in her own way, what it meant to be seen. And Ethan gave a small nod, not claiming the moment, not owning it, just acknowledging it. And for a brief second, everything felt still again, not frozen, but settled, like something had found its place. And then Victoria reached into her bag, her movements smooth, unhurried, drawing attention without demanding it, and she pulled out a card, simple, clean, unadorned, and held it lightly between her fingers, not extending it yet, not offering it as a transaction, but as a continuation. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, grounded. "If you ever decide that you want more than this," she said, her eyes meeting his with clarity, "I would like to hear from you." And then she placed the card in his hand, not pressing it, not insisting, just leaving it there. And that was what made it powerful, because it was not a reward, it was not a favor, it was a door, and whether it opened or not would never depend on her alone. Part 6, full 600 words, voiceover ready. For a moment after the card touched his hand, nothing else in the room seemed to exist, not the soft clink of glassware, not the low hum of conversation slowly returning, not even the quiet shift of people trying to pretend they had not been watching so closely. And Ethan looked down at the card. Not immediately, not with urgency, but with the same measured awareness he had carried through the entire night, his fingers holding it lightly, as if it weighed more than it should. And when he finally glanced at it, he did not react the way most would. No widened eyes, no sudden realization, just a brief pause, a quiet acknowledgement of something he had not been expecting. And then he looked back up at Victoria, his expression unchanged, grounded, steady, and she met his gaze without hesitation, as if she had already anticipated that reaction, as if she had expected him not to be moved by the name alone. And that, more than anything, confirmed what she had seen earlier. And behind them, the manager shifted again, his posture now fully adjusted, respectful, careful, the tension replaced with something closer to deference. and a nearby table resumed their conversation in hushed tones, the moment beginning to release its hold on the room, but not completely, not yet, because something of it still lingered, still moved quietly between people, and Lily looked at the card in Ethan's hand with curiosity, her head tilting slightly. "What is it?" she asked softly, and Ethan lowered it just enough for her to see, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, just sharing it the way he shared everything else with her, and she studied it for a second, not recognizing the name, not understanding the weight it carried in the world beyond that room, and then she looked back up at him. "Is she important?" she asked, her voice simple, honest, and Ethan paused, the question settling into him in a way that did not need to be answered quickly, and then he gave a small, thoughtful nod. "She is to you," he said gently, and that answer was enough, because importance, in that moment, was not about power or money or reputation. It was about what had just happened, what had been given and received without expectation. And Lily smiled faintly, satisfied with that, her attention returning briefly to her mother, who stood quietly, watching, her expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but softened in a way that suggested something deeper had shifted within her. And Victoria took a small step back then, not retreating, not withdrawing, but allowing the moment to settle into its natural place, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost reflective. "Moments like this are rare," she said, not addressing the room, not making a statement for others, but speaking directly to Ethan. "Most people walk past them." And Ethan listened, his posture unchanged, his presence still grounded in something that did not depend on recognition, and he nodded once, slowly. "Most people are busy," he replied, and the words carried no judgment, no criticism, just truth. And Victoria's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that acknowledged the simplicity of that answer and the depth behind it. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke again, because the moment did not need more words. It had already reached its natural conclusion, and Lily reached for her mother's hand, her fingers slipping into it with quiet familiarity, grounding the space in something simple, something real, and Victoria looked down at her, her expression softening once more, then back at Ethan, and with a final nod, small but certain, she turned, her movement smooth, controlled, and began to walk back toward her table, her presence still carrying through the room even as she stepped away, and the manager moved quickly to follow, his tone lowered, attentive. "Ms. Harper, we can prepare anything you need." But she shook her head slightly, dismissing the offer without breaking her stride, because what she had come for had already happened. And as she reached her table and sat down, the restaurant slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming, glasses lifted again, the rhythm of the evening continuing as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. And yet for those who had seen it, truly seen it, something had changed in a way that would not fade when the lights dimmed and the night ended. And Ethan remained where he was for just a second longer, the card still in his hand, not gripping it, not examining it again, just holding it. And then he slipped it into his pocket with the same quiet care he gave everything else, not as a decision, not as a commitment, just as a possibility. And in that simple gesture, the moment closed, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with something far more lasting, the quiet understanding that some choices do not end when they are made, they begin. The rest of the evening returned to motion, but it did not return to what it had been before, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing in soft layers of sound, glasses clinking, quiet laughter, low conversations, yet beneath it all there was something different now, something that had settled into the space and refused to leave, and Ethan moved the way he always did, steady, precise, attentive, carrying plates, refilling water, answering requests without hesitation, without drawing attention. And yet attention found him anyway, not openly, not directly, but in the way people paused a second longer when he passed, in the way their eyes followed him just briefly before returning to their tables, as if they were trying to reconcile the man they had just seen with the role he now resumed so easily. And Lily sat with her mother, her posture more relaxed than it had been at any point earlier in the evening, her hands no longer folded tightly in her lap, her gaze no longer fixed on the floor, but moving freely across the room, taking in the space without shrinking from it. And Victoria watched her, not with concern now, but with quiet observation, as if she were witnessing a change she had hoped for but not expected to see so suddenly. And every so often, Lily's eyes would find Ethan again, not in need, not in uncertainty, but in recognition, like someone who had been seen once and would not forget what that felt like. And across the room, two guests leaned slightly closer to each other, their voices low, careful not to carry. "That was different," one said, and the other nodded slowly. "You could feel it," he replied. And that was the thing about moments like that. They did not stay contained. They moved, quietly, subtly, from one person to another, not as a story, not as gossip, but as a feeling that lingered long after the moment itself had passed. And the manager, still adjusting to the shift he could not control, moved through the room with a new kind of awareness, his posture straighter, his tone more measured, as if he were recalibrating his understanding of what had just taken place. And when Ethan approached his station again, placing an empty tray down with the same quiet precision as before, the manager hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Just keep it professional," he said, but the sharpness that had been there earlier was gone, replaced with something uncertain, almost respectful, and Ethan nodded once, not reacting, not engaging further, because he did not need to defend what had already been done, and that was what made it different. He did not carry the moment with him as something to prove. He carried it as something that simply was. And across the room, Victoria lifted her glass slowly, her eyes still moving occasionally toward Ethan, not in scrutiny, not in evaluation, but in quiet acknowledgement. And when she set the glass back down, her fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary, as if she were holding on to something she had not yet decided how to define. And Lily leaned slightly closer to her, her voice soft, but filled with something lighter than before. "Mom, can we stay a little longer?" And Victoria looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the change that had already begun, and she gave a small nod. "Of course," she said gently, and the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than anyone else in the room could understand. And as the evening continued, the restaurant settled into a new kind of normal, not the same as before, not entirely different, but altered in a way that could not be undone. And Ethan moved through it all with the same steady rhythm, not aware of how many eyes still followed him, not aware of how many quiet conversations had begun because of a single choice, not aware of how far that moment had already started to reach beyond the walls of that room. And that was the truth of it. The most powerful actions are often the ones taken without the need to be seen, without the need to be remembered, and yet they are the ones that stay, that echo, that shift something deeper than surface or sound. And as the night moved forward, that echo continued to spread, quiet, steady, undeniable. By the time the last course was served and the music softened into its final set, the restaurant no longer felt like the same place it had been at the start of the evening. Not because anything dramatic had changed on the surface, but because something quieter had settled into it, something that lingered in the way people spoke more carefully, in the way they looked at one another just a second longer. And Ethan continued moving through the room with the same steady rhythm, clearing plates, refilling glasses, responding to requests without pause, without hesitation, and yet every movement now seemed to carry a different kind of weight, not imposed, not demanded, just noticed. And Lily remained seated beside her mother, her posture relaxed, her hands no longer folded tightly in her lap, but resting openly on the table, her gaze drifting occasionally toward the small space where she had stood earlier, where she had taken those careful steps. And each time she looked, a faint smile returned, as if she were revisiting something she did not want to lose. And Victoria watched her with quiet attention, her expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but thoughtful, as if she were seeing her daughter in a way she had not been able to before. And after a moment, she leaned slightly closer, her voice low, gentle. "How do you feel?" she asked, and Lily took a small breath, considering the question with more care than someone her age usually would. "Different," she said softly, and the simplicity of that answer carried more meaning than any explanation could. And Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing it, not analyzing it, just letting it exist. And across the room, a man who had once laughed now sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass, his expression thoughtful, as if replaying the moment in his own mind. and near the entrance, a couple paused before leaving, glancing back once more, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to reflection, and the manager moved through the space with measured steps, his earlier confidence replaced by a quieter awareness, a recognition that control was not always the same as influence. And when he passed by Ethan again, he did not interrupt, he did not correct, he simply nodded once. A small acknowledgement that required no words, and Ethan returned it just as simply, his focus already shifting to the next table, the next task, because that was who he was, someone who did what needed to be done without holding on to the moment, without reshaping it into something else. And as the evening drew closer to its end, Victoria reached for her glass once more, then paused, her hand hovering just above it as her gaze moved again toward Ethan, and for a brief second, something in her expression shifted, not outwardly, not enough for others to see, but enough to mark a decision forming beneath the surface, and she leaned back slightly, her voice calm but purposeful as she spoke to the assistant seated nearby. "Make sure we have everything we need," she said, not specifying, not explaining, but the instruction carried weight nonetheless, and the assistant nodded immediately, already understanding more than had been said, and Lily turned her head. Again, watching Ethan as he moved across the room, her voice soft but certain. "He did not treat me like I was broken," she said, and Victoria looked at her, her expression softening once more. "No," she replied gently. "He did not." And that was when it became clear, not just to her, but to anyone paying close enough attention, that what had happened that night was not simply an isolated moment, not simply a gesture of kindness, but something that had reached further, something that had begun to reshape how at least one person saw the world. And as the final guests began to leave, coats gathered, chairs pushed back, quiet goodbyes exchanged, the restaurant returned to its closing rhythm. But the echo of what had taken place did not fade with the lights. It remained, carried forward in small, unseen ways, in thoughts, in choices, in the subtle shift of awareness that follows a moment that cannot be undone. And as Ethan cleared the last table and paused for just a second, looking out across the now quiet room, he did not see what others had seen. He did not measure the impact of what had happened. He simply saw the work that had been done and the work that would begin again tomorrow. And in that quiet understanding, something continued to move beyond him, beyond the room, beyond the night itself, steady, real, and just beginning. The restaurant closed quietly, the way places like that always do, without spectacle, without announcement, lights dimming one section at a time, chairs lifted, tables reset for a tomorrow that had not yet arrived, and Ethan moved through it all with the same steady rhythm he had carried from the beginning, stacking plates, wiping surfaces, finishing what needed to be finished without drawing attention to it. And when the last glass was set down and the final light above the dining area faded, the room settled into a stillness that felt different now, not empty, but complete, like something meaningful had passed through and left its mark without needing to stay. And Ethan stepped outside into the cool night air, the city quieter than it had been hours earlier. The distant hum of traffic softened into a low, constant background, and he paused for a moment, not to reflect in any dramatic way, but simply to breathe, to let the shift from movement to stillness settle naturally. And across the street, a black car remained parked, its engine silent, its presence understated but deliberate, and after a second, the rear door opened, and Victoria stepped out, her posture as composed as ever, her expression calm. But there was something different now, something that had been shaped by the evening in ways she did not need to explain, and Ethan noticed her then, not surprised, not unsettled, just aware, and he gave a small nod, acknowledging her presence without assuming her purpose, and she approached him with the same measured steps she had carried all night, stopping just close enough to speak without raising her voice. "I thought I might find you here," she said, and her tone was not formal, not distant, but grounded, as if this conversation did not belong to the world she usually operated in, and Ethan nodded once, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "It is where I am," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to settle something unspoken between them, and for a brief moment, neither of them continued, the quiet of the street holding the space for what came next. And then Victoria spoke again, her voice softer now, more personal than before. She has not stopped talking about it, she said, referring to Lily without needing to say her name. And Ethan allowed the faintest shift in his expression, something that might have been a smile, something that did not need to be seen clearly to be understood, and he nodded. That is good, he said, and she studied him for a second, not evaluating, not measuring, just observing, as if trying to understand how someone could remain so unchanged after a moment that had shifted so much for others. And then she took a breath, steady, deliberate, and when she spoke again, her words carried a quiet clarity. I meant what I said earlier, she said, about the opportunity. And Ethan listened, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, and she continued. But this is not about offering you something because of what you did. She paused briefly, as if choosing to be precise. It is about recognizing something that already exists, and the distinction mattered, because it removed obligation, it removed expectation, and left only choice. And Ethan considered that, not as a man weighing advantage, but as someone who understood the difference between being given something and being seen for something. And after a moment, he gave a small nod. I understand, he said, and Victoria held his gaze for a second longer, then inclined her head slightly, acknowledging that the conversation did not need to be extended, that what needed to be said had already been said, and she stepped back, her movement controlled, final without being abrupt. And as she turned toward the car, she added one last thing, her voice, carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the quiet of the street. You did more than you think. And then she entered the car, the door closing softly behind her, and the vehicle pulled away without urgency, disappearing into the night as quietly as it had arrived. And Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, not watching it go, not following it with his eyes, but simply standing in the space where the moment had just passed. And then he turned, walking toward the direction of home, his steps steady, unchanged, and somewhere behind him, in a place far removed from the quiet street, something had already begun to move, something that would carry that moment further than he would ever see, further than he would ever need to. And as the final image settled, the empty street, the fading lights, the man who never asked to be noticed, the voice would come in, low, calm, carrying the weight of everything without needing to rise. Sometimes, the world changes in loud ways that everyone can see. A brief pause, letting the silence breathe. But sometimes, it changes quietly, in a single moment, in a single choice, when someone decides to see what others choose to ignore. And the screen would fade slowly, not into emptiness, but into something softer, something that stays just a little longer than expected. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of the kind of person you want to be when it matters most, take a moment to subscribe, because sometimes the quietest choices are the ones that echo the furthest. And then, gently, without rush, the story would end.